Hey guys, you're watching Concept, and in this tutorial I'm gonna show you how to create this selection box, how to select actors. As you can see, these are selected with this green thing, and when selected, how to move those actors. It will all be done in C++, so let's get started. First things first, let's create a new project. It will be C++ project top down because we are making RTS selection, and we will call it RTS select and move. Okay, create a project. Okay, when we create our project, we will see that in our content, top-down CPP blueprints, we have this top-down character. It's actually a character with a camera, but we will ignore his camera, and we will create our own camera, which will be possessed by our player controller. It will be of a pawn class, so camera pawn. And now we will say camera components. It will be root, and we will say possess. So this camera will be possessed by our player controller, and to put it in a world. So why I'm doing this in Blueprint, it's because this is just a basic setup. Our selection and our movement will be done in C++. So when we hit play, okay. So what do we need for selection and movement? We need our C++ classes, and we will create two C++ class. One will be player controller, and other will be our HUD. So let's first make player controller. Player controller. Okay, it will be RTS. RTS player controller. Now our player controller is created. Let's get back to Unreal Engine and let's create HUD. So of a HUD class, it will be called RTS HUD. Okay, create class. Now let's make our constructor for our player controller. We will need this name. So A paste that name, and we will say in constructor B show mouse cursor is equal to true, and we will need to define this in .h file. So public, and we will say default mouse cursor is equal to E. Okay, so it will be crosshair. Let's create begin, play, and input component. Setup input component. So we will need this. Begin play. This will need for our inputs, and we will have to define this in our .h file. So we'll say virtual void begin play over ride. Okay, and we will do the same for setup input component. Why virtual void override? Because this class have this virtual, and we have to override the parent. And yeah, I forgot, we have to say void, and also here void. Now let's get back to our engine and go to our project settings, and in our inputs we will create two new. The first one will be left mouse click, and the second one will be right mouse click. left mouse button, and this one is right mouse button. Remember these names, these are the names of the inputs. So let's save all and get back to our C++ classes. So we know the name of the input, so input component, we will bind action to it. So when we press, something will happen. So the first name was left mouse click, and we will say it to when pressed. So we need a class, this class, and we need what function to run, what method to run. So we will need this name, and the action will be called selection pressed. For now we don't have that selection pressed, but we'll create it in our player controller. So that is when left mouse is clicked, and we will need a release. Selection released. Also released. Okay, also we will need for right mouse button. Right mouse button will move our characters to locations, so we only need release. So when it's released, characters will move to that location. So we can copy this. Left mouse click, it's right mouse click. I released, okay. Selection. It will be move released. Okay. Now let's create these methods which will fire when we press left or release left or right, doesn't matter. So we will need this. Void. Okay, that one is created. Selection released. And we need move released. Okay, in our .h file we can also create those. We will say protected void selection pressed void selection released and void move released. Okay, now we can compile build solution. When our compile is complete, we can create our first variables. So let's go to our HUD and say public f vector 2d initial point, and we will also create current. So why do we need these points? They will be points for drawing a rectangle. Initial position will be position of our vector when we press, and current will be while we hold. So for example, in Photoshop, this first one is initial and this is a current. So this is initial and the current is this one which changes while we are holding our mouse. Okay, I wrote down comments. So we will need one function. It will give us f vector 2d, and that function will be called get mouse position 2d. So it will give us a position of a mouse on our screen, and we will define this. Just a second. So RTS HUD, so a RTS HUD. Okay. So if we get owning player controller. So we get player controller which owns us, and we say get mouse position. This function will give us a 2D position of our mouse, so position of mouse on screen, but we need to feed it with float x and float y. This reference signs means that whatever float is as input, it will be changed. So this function will change it and put it a value of whatever mouse position is. So in that case, we need to create float position x and float position y. That position x, we will feed it with position x and position y, and they will be changed. Now we will return f vector 2D, which consists of position x and position y. Oh, sorry. And that's pretty much it, yeah. So we created a function which gives us f vector 2D of our mouse position. Now we have to make a pointer to our HUD. So a RTS HUD pointer will be HUD PTR, but we also need to include that class, include RTS HUD, and we will say build solution. Now our compile is complete, and you can see we defined our HUD pointer, and in our begin play we'll say HUD PTR is equal to cast ARTS HUD get HUD. So let's explain this. We have our pointer defined, but it is not assigned. To assign it, we can actually we have to cast it, because with get HUD function we only get whatever HUD is bind to this player controller. We get a HUD class, as you can see, but we need to get its child. Its child is RTS HUD. So check if this get HUD which is a RTS HUD. If it is, assign it to HUD pointer. Now we got our HUD pointer to our RTS HUD, and we can access it. So when we left press, we selection press, we say HUD PTR access initial point. So our initial point of our rectangle, selection rectangle, will be equal to HUD PTR get mouse position 2D. So it will be equal to this function. It will only initialize once, and that will be our static point of our rectangle selection. Okay, so when we press, we get our initial point. Now we have to get a current point. Current point needs to be updated point, which will be updated every tick. In this case, for RTS HUD, we use draw. So in our RTS HUD, we will say void ARTS HUD draw HUD. This draw HUD is the same as tick in actors. So we defined it here, and we also need to put it so virtual void draw HUD override same as tick. So in our draw HUD, we will say that our current point will be equal to get mouse position 2D Okay, so that our current point will be updated, but we need to set some bools. So we'll say bool b start selecting. It will be false by default, and we will say do not update that current point until that's true. So if not of if b start selecting is equal to true. So if that's equal to true, set that current point to mouse position on every tick. And we also have to do one more thing, is that when we press, so our HUD PTR B start, what's its name, start selecting. So when we left click, when we selection is pressed, B start selecting equals to true. Okay, so when we press, we initialize, make initial point, and after that every update it creates a current point. So let's finally draw that rectangle selection. So draw rect, so it needs F linear color. We will see RGB alpha, so 001 it will be in B, and alpha 0.15 F. Okay, that is the color of rectangle. We need that initial position, that is screen X and screen Y. That will be initial point X, initial point Y. Next thing is width and height. Width we get by subtracting the current position and initial position. So current point, actually point not position, X minus initial point X, and we can put it down here, and current point Y, that is for height, minus initial point Y. Okay, so that is for drawing. And before we compile, I made one mistake. This should be double equal sign, and in our player controller get mouse position this should have brackets, yeah. And in setup input component I forgot this super setup input component. If you don't put this, the game will crash. Now finally we can say compile, and when compile is complete we can go back to our game. We will make blueprint class game mode, and we will say RTS game mode. And in our RTS game mode we'll say HUD class RTS HUD, pawn will be our camera pawn, and our player controller will be RTS player controller. Okay. In our project settings we will go to maps and modes and put RTS game mode. Okay. Now let's play. And we can say that we have a selection rectangle, but when we release it is still stuck. This happens because we did not say what to do when released. So on selection released we should say HUD false. So start selecting will be false. And after this everything should work fine. And we go back to the game and we say play, and yeah, everything's working fine. This is the end of the first part, and in the next part we'll make that selection, select players and move players, so stick with us.